Kelly, thank you for being here. We're going to move over to you.
Okay.
Um, so appreciate you being here. I would love it if you could introduce yourself, say a little bit about your work, and then we'll look forward to hearing more.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me, everyone. I'm excited to be here. And thank you, Ebert. And thank you for the translation services. That was the impromptu translation services. That was wonderful. Um, so let's see where I'm going to jump in pretty quickly here, because there's so much more that I want to hear about after my presentation. I want to be sure we have a lot of time. So, Cassiana, thank you. Um, so, my work over time has evolved to be 100% online. I started out in Los Angeles doing social skills groups and really specializing in social skills. Um, in a lot of Los Angeles, at least, or California, social skills is done by a variety of different professionals. You know, we have occupational therapists, speech therapists, psychologists, a lot of different people provide social skills, but it's really my focus and my specialty. So I consider myself a social learning specialist. Um, so my work is supporting the social learning of children, teenagers, adults on the autism spectrum for the most part. And along with that, I do a lot of work with parents and teachers to help them support social learning in ways that make sense for an autistic person and are accessible and appropriate to the way an autistic person's neurology works. So that's me. That's what I do. How's that, Karen?
Beautiful.
Okay. All right. So today, I'd like to share. Oh, and it says Canada on my little name tag because I've up and moved to Canada, but my practice is still primarily based in Los Angeles. So this is one of those weird effects of the pandemic and everyone going online is that I guess we can do this from wherever. A lot of us can. So I want to share my screen with you. Today, I'd like to jump right in and focus on this approach to thinking about autism. I know that in your model, and most practitioners today don't really strictly adhere necessarily to the DSM or the other international um, what do you help me out, Karen? The
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you're talking about?
right. Not every
Yes.
we're not
DSM
so
5, and they're coming out with a new one. Yes, that one.
it has some utility, but I understand that we're all not we're not fiercely wedded to it. Um, and for many years, there's been a big concern in the autistic community that the DSM is pretty pathologizing. The language of it can be very, very pathologizing for a lot of autistic people. So, this is Kelly Priest's totally unscientific 5-factor model of autism. It's I will share it with you. Everything I have will be shared with you by the end of the session. But I started out working in child maltreatment, and some of you, Ebert, may be familiar with this. Many of you may be familiar with David Finkelhor's 5-factor model, multifactorial model of child sexual abuse. So that idea of a multifactorial model always stayed with me, even though the focus of my work shifted about 20 years ago. So this is a multifactorial model, and the 5 factors or characteristics or traits that we commonly see in autistic people are sensory motor differences, which is what I'm going to focus on today, high need for sameness, order, and routine, intense, narrow, focused interests, verbal and nonverbal communication differences, and detail orientation versus gestalt.
Um,
So, yeah,
uh, uh, there was a question about enlarging it because it's hard for us to see.
thank you.
And I want everyone to know that I just put it in the chat too.
Yeah,
So you can click on it and see it on your screen at the same time. But Kelly, oh, great. That's perfect.
there we go. How's that,
But
everyone?
you can also see it because I just put it in the chat. Thanks,
Okay.
Kelly.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Okay. So, it is usually, and I read a lot of neuropsych assessments, a lot. I read one a week. I know that there are many different valid conceptualizations of autism. This is not the conceptualization of autism. This is a way I've found to explain autism to parents, primarily to parents, is understanding that it is the interplay of these 5 characteristics or traits that commonly pop up. And with most people on the autism spectrum, most of the time I find that these 5 characteristics are present. So if it's just 1 or 2 or at a subclinical level, we may be talking about something else. But when you see these 5 characteristics showing up in one individual, that may be something to consider. Okay. So I'm going to focus today just on sensory motor differences, and I'm going to describe how they show up in the population I see. And maybe you can be thinking about some of the children that you work with. I was delighted to see that about a third of you identify as working with autistic children. And probably, probably all of you do at one time or another. Statistically, I have to point out, one or more of you may be on the spectrum yourselves. So if I consider myself to be an avid student of autism, but I don't consider myself to be an expert. I consider autistic people to be the real experts on themselves. But this is what I've learned. So you can see I have lots and lots of collected examples here of in each of these categories. I'm going to talk about what I'm going to focus on today is just everything in this column, sensory motor differences. So jumping right in, sensitivities to certain kinds of lights, sounds, motion, touch, tastes. Sensitivities are kind of something that's really commonly associated with autism. I think we think about sensitivity to tags in the clothing and things like that. I shared a story with Karen earlier about my own. I have 2 children, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. And when this child was about 8 or 9, they were drumming in a band. Let's hear it from all the heavy metal fans out there. They were drumming in a band, and I thought to ask my kid, how come you can participate in a heavy metal band and play all of Metallica's Ride the Lightning album for 2 hours, but you couldn't participate in PE at school? Why was that? What made it so hard? Because there's an incongruence there that I didn't really understand. And my kid thought about it for a minute and said, "Oh, it's chaotic noise. I know that whole Metallica album, so I know what's coming. And I know the bandmates that I have, so I know that Reed is gonna hit a few flat notes on the keyboard, but I expect that." And in PE, it was random chaotic noise. So it was the shoes squeaking on the gym floor, it was the balls being dribbled, it was the coach blowing up my head with the whistle. Every once in a while, there was a bird that was in the gymnasium, in the fan that was tweeting, and there was the airplane going overhead. And I felt like I couldn't process all that chaotic noise, and I felt like my insides were going to come out of me. So this changed my thinking a lot about sensory systems. For me, this was a revelation. For me, this meant we have very different sensory systems. We have very different ways of processing sensory input. And it allowed me to start thinking about sensory input in a way that I simply hadn't before. I think I had made a lot of assumptions before. So sensitivities can be beyond the surface sensitivities that we think of when we think of children on the autism spectrum. There are also hyposensitivities. That's needing extra input to our vestibular system. You know, remember, vestibular system is where am I in space? Needing heavy or specific input, proprioceptive input, which is pressure to regulate. I have also permission to share from my kid to share that they recently managed, they're 18 now, and managed to go get blood drawn by themselves for a medical procedure, and had a vasovagal reaction to it and threw up and passed out, and then woke up and threw up again and passed out again. And their girlfriend brought them home, and they were really in quite a state by the time they got home. And I said, do you need a squish? Which was something that I used to say when they were really little. And they said, they were lying on the sofa, and they said yes. And I flipped all the sofa cushions over. I haven't done this in 10 years with this kid, but they needed it. And so I flipped all the sofa cushions over and then started piling things on top of the sofa cushions and piling more heavy things on top of the sofa cushions. And does anybody have a guess about what happened next? What did my kid do? Any guesses? They went right to sleep.
Soothe them. Yeah.
Yeah. But when I say they went right to sleep, they closed their eyes and they were out like a light for about 2 or 3 hours. So we think about sensitivities, also think about hyposensitivities, seeking input. And then to make things exciting, a mix of hypo and hypersensitivities is very, very common. In fact, most of the time we will see hypo and hypersensitivities. For your work with children, you cannot underestimate the importance of interoception. Kelly Mahler, Mahler, she's in my references at the end of this. I have links for all of this for you. Kelly Mahler is doing fantastic work in interoception. Interoception is the brain's interpretation of internal bodily sensations, right? That all of that input from our internal organs, our viscera, all of that needs to go upstairs for processing, and then we need to make meaning of it. And then we need to figure out what the heck to do, right? So this can impact toileting skills. Clearly, those are internal bodily sensations, sleep regulation, and particularly important, identification of emotions. Not everyone has a standard sensory system, and where we see children who have great difficulty attaching language to emotions, there are a number of different reasons why that may be, and one of many possible reasons could be that they don't interpret, their brain doesn't interpret those internal signals from their viscera and from their internal organs in a common way. Fine motor skills may be highly developed for playing an instrument, for example, but not writing, right? Again, one of those how come questions. How come you can play the drums like this and you can do such subtle things and play jazz and play rock and roll? And how come getting writing to come out of the end of your hand is so hard? Coordination of large and small muscles, sequencing of multiple interconnected motor activities may develop later or be a lifelong challenge. Sequencing of multiple interconnected motor activities. So I work with a physician who works at a big managed care company, and she's a wonderful family physician, and she can manage all of the functions of her job, partly because she has a medical assistant who's been trained to help her specifically and provide appropriate accommodations. And going to the grocery store, getting the groceries, bringing them home, unpacking them, and then taking some back out to prepare a meal, and then cleaning up after a meal, that is not something that she is really capable of doing yet. And so she requires assistance with that particular activity of daily living. Food prep is a big, big one for a lot of people on the spectrum. Visual perception differences. These are brain-based processing differences. And some people on the spectrum, I know a lot of people are familiar with Temple Grandin and thinking in pictures, that idea that autistic people can think in pictures or think in movies. Some people on the autism spectrum are able to have a very, very vivid visual memory. And so this really comes into play when we're talking about children's awareness of current events like war. Autistic children can have a vivid visual memory that is incredibly graphic, that is intrusive, and their primary way of processing traumatic things like war, for example, or family violence may be visual. And so when we think about how much information we add and the modalities in which we add it, that's a consideration for all of us to think about. What are we adding that they may not be able to process and integrate? Self-stimulation for self-regulation or joy, tapping, swaying, rocking, chewing on shirts or fingers, repeating sounds or words or phrases, or 20-minute pieces of dialogue from a movie, scrutinizing shadows, dust, and textures. We think of self-stimulation as a necessary function for self-regulation, but increasingly autistic people are telling us that there is an autistic joy that is experienced, not just relief, but joy. And so as long as stimming is not harming anyone else, or the child is not seriously harming themselves, let them stim. Motor planning and sequencing, also, that kind of goes with that sequencing thing. I work with many adults who still have trouble tying their shoes, and there are a lot of shoes in this world that don't have ties, and that is just fine. Okay, so we Karen and I talked about how to potentially process this information. I know that's been kind of a big chunk of information. A lot of it you guys already probably knew, but I wanted to present it kind of all at once in a sort of brain dump fashion. And so, Karen, do you want to introduce the World Cafe or do you want me to introduce it?
Um, go ahead and then we can talk. Um, Lynn is here to help with the logistics of it.
Okay.
So, but please introduce the concept because it came from you, and so I'd love to hear from you.
Okay. All right. So, here, before I get into that, here, all of these links are compiled specifically for this group. I went through a lot of my resources and I pulled out what I thought would be most useful to this particular group. I want to bring your attention specifically to Rabbi Ruti Regan is autistic, and she, among many things that she does, she has a blog called Real Social Skills, and she has a piece that is a must read. It's a little bracing, so be strong and be ready when you read it, called Nice Lady Therapists. Um, there's the piece by Mikola Bilokonski about, it's a recent piece about how to talk about autism respectfully. And I have a number of other resources for you here. I have a Twitter hashtag if you want to learn from autistic people on Twitter. There are a lot of autistic people out on Twitter. The one TV show that I like about with autistic characters is As We See It. I don't know if everyone can access it, but if you can, that's a good one. And a book. It's very difficult to find books where autistic characters are not side characters, or the point of the story is that they overcome their autism, or they're used as a vehicle for some other character to show how heroic and great they are. But one fantastic Own Voices book by Sarah Caput, an autistic author, is Get a Grip, Vivi Cohen. It's about a 12-year-old girl who's autistic and has a fantastic knuckleball. It's a great story. It's rich and it's a beautifully well-written, fantastic story. So those are my little recommendations for you. And everyone will have access to that. Okay, so a World Cafe. This is not my idea. This is a thing that you may want to use. You may find use for this at some point in your work. A World Cafe is a way for people to discuss an essential question in a large group, to break it down into a small group format. Okay. Um, I'm going to give you an essential question. I'll skip over to the essential question. We're going to discuss in what ways is your own sensory motor system ordinary, and or in what ways is your own sensory motor system extraordinary? What assumptions do you tend to make based on your experience of your own sensory system? And what impact could these assumptions have on your work? That's what I came to with an essential question. What do you think, Karen?
Great.
Okay. So when we discuss these, we're going to break out into smaller groups. And I like to make visuals for everything I do, whether I'm teaching self-regulation, flexible thinking, thinking as part of a group, any social communication, perspective taking. I have a master's degree in thought bubbles and stick figures. So I am all about the stick figures. Also puppets. I have puppets over my shoulder here too. A bowl full of puppets. But so in round one, we will break out into small groups of 4 or 5 people. Logistically, it might be, I don't know, where you guys will tell me if
Work
it's
it
going to be
out.
5 or
We'll
maybe
work it
even
out.
6. Okay. We're going to have a guide. You in your small groups, you're going to need to decide on a guide, and you're going to need to decide quickly. The guide will take notes, distill each contributor's thoughts. Here's your guide, right? They're listening and taking notes. They're going to distill each contributor's thoughts to a takeaway. And you're going to have time. Each contributor will share their thoughts on this essential question, which will be right in front of you. You'll see it. 1 minute per contributor. So 1 minute for you, then 1 minute for you, 1 minute for you, 1 minute for you. There will be a timekeeper in your group too. You'll have to decide on a timekeeper to keep everyone on track. Now, this person can also be a contributor, but maybe if you have someone in your group who's not in a space to share today, or they're not sure they have much to add on this, if they'd prefer to be the timekeeper instead, that's okay, right? So they could be timekeeper and a contributor, or they could just be the timekeeper, okay? Then you will have 2 minutes after everyone contributes for the group to connect and synthesize ideas from these contributions and help the guide get them down as takeaways. Everybody with me so far? Okay.
Yes, and maybe you could give an example, like what's something that you would say about your sensory system?
Okay,
Like
so
what's
for me, I'll just say for me personally. Um I have realized over time that it is a function partly of my sensory system that I have difficulty initiating motor action on non preferred tasks. And when I say difficulty initiating action, I mean well outside that kind of like subclinical, like I don't really want to do things I don't want to do. I have ADHD. I've been diagnosed twice as an adult. I actually have difficulty getting my body moving to do non-preferred tasks, to get into motion, cleaning my house. I really need someone else in my house to also be cleaning, and then I can borrow their physical energy to get myself moving. Once I get over that initiation task, I can be in motion and I can do very well. But that's an example of a sensory motor aspect. It's not just procrastination. It's not just this or that. I also had a lot of trouble initiating the motor action of writing papers. My first career was in journalism, so writing was my work, but initiation is particularly challenging for me, to the point that it can be disabling. So, seeing that, understanding that as one piece of a sensory motor challenge that I really do have, has helped me think very differently about how challenging some sensory issues are for some of my students that I work with to get through an entire school day.
okay?
So that's an example of something that I would share. Now, if we have a lot of sensory motor challenges, does that mean that we're autistic? No. The takeaway is not that everyone is a little bit autistic. Everyone is not a little bit autistic. And after almost every training I do, I get a thank you note from someone saying, "Thank you for teaching me that everyone is a little bit autistic." Nope, 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 wave off. Everyone is not a little bit autistic. People can have quite a few characteristics in a number of these different categories and still not be autistic, right? But we're talking just today about that sensory motor function, just the sensory motor, our own sensory motor differences. How ordinary are your sensory motor systems? How average, how standard, how common are your sensory motor systems? There's probably a bulk of people who experience sensory input in pretty similar ways, pretty standard ways. And there are probably a lot of us who can identify that we have some differences in our sensory motor system. So the question is, how ordinary versus extraordinary is your sensory motor system? And what does that mean for your practice? Okay.
Okay, perfect.
So
Perfect.
we're going to discuss that in small groups. Then for round 2, the guides are going to rotate to a second group. So guide 1 in group 1 is going to go to group 2. The guide from group 2 is going to go to group 3, and so on. Okay? When we start that second round, the guides will report on the old group's key takeaways to the new group. You'll spend 1 or 2 minutes on that. Then the second group's contributors will share their responses to those takeaways.
Okay.
You'll have 2 minutes to discuss the connections, patterns, insights, deeper questions, and help the guide get them down. And then the guide will report the takeaway to the whole group. So this is a logistical feat, and wish us luck with getting everyone into breakout rooms and then changing the guides. We may have to be a little bit patient with moving the guides around. The guiding principle of World Cafe is that wisdom is present and accessible. We are finding it and articulating it by these means. We will listen to understand, connect diverse perspectives, speak your mind and heart, focus on what matters, speak leanly, you have 1 minute, and listen together for patterns, insights, and deeper questions. Okay. And
Okay.
I'm going to keep this up. I don't know if you can take this into your breakout rooms. Maybe there's a way to do that, but you all have this document. So this is just your reminder. The senses I have listed here to help you kind of spur your thinking about sensory differences or sensory standards. I have some notes here that might help you kind of think about different ways of processing your sensory system. And then just the reminder for our ways of processing information in a World Cafe.
Okay. We're going to need to get started, or we're going to, so let's get started. People, because I uploaded your thing, they're going to have it.
Okay, so I'm going to stop
Natalia,
the share.
okay,
Kelly,
great.
how long do you want people to be in the first breakout room?
About 6 or 7 minutes.
Okay, so everybody, once you're in your rooms, I will come visit you to find out who your guides are. And then I'll let you know when you're getting close to your 6 minutes and it'll be time to change.
Welcome back. So just in the interest of time, we're just changing, you were presented, Kelly presented this really interesting idea of the World Cafe. And if we had more time, and even it sounds like really great if you're in person where you switch people. I love that idea. But just in the interest of time, we're going to have the reporters or observers from each group just say a couple of things that you observe from your group in the larger group rather than switch. And maybe we can, if you don't mind that.
And I can call on the groups by number because I made a note of who all the guides are. That might make it smooth.
That's fantastic.
So
Perfect.
So Debbie, you were the guide for group 1.
Yeah. You want me to report on what we talked about?
Yeah, just a couple key points.
I guess just difficulty with proprioception and not really knowing if you have superpowers. I mean, super sensory powers.
Okay. Um, is there something specific about that? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but I don't know since we weren't there. Anything you'd want to elaborate about the superpower part?
No, I mean, just we don't know if we have any sensory superpowers. Like,
Oh,
it
I
doesn't,
see.
yeah.
I see. Okay. All right. Great.
So
Thank you.
room 2 was Jane.
Hi there. Yes, I mean our group was quite interesting. It all the mentions were of smell and how smell, their super sense of smell aided within a session because so many things could be picked up. So, for example, body temperature. If a client's body temperature had changed, that could be picked up, and what the client may bring with them into the room, like their washing powder smell, perfume, just all these little things that made each client very different. And I'm also wondering myself if the client could be sitting there with the practitioner not even knowing who it was, but could they deter who it was, who just by their sense of smell, could they discern who it was? And it was just quite interesting to hear that. I don't think we talked about many negative things about it. It didn't seem to be a negative side to it. It didn't seem to be hindering anything. It was just very, very interesting that ours were just about smell and how it affected us.
Thank
Great.
you.
Room number 3 was Chris.
We were having we talked more extensively about being sensitive to loud noise, and that too much loud noise makes a person not being able to react or think straight or not anything at all. Like there's a strong need to really stop that loud noise, and one can feel completely overwhelmed. And then somebody said they have a patient that has a very strange loud laugh, and when that person laughs, when that girl laughs, she doesn't even feel like being in the same room with her anymore. It's so subtle. Also sensitivity to touch, too light or too hard. And on the other side, we also talked about a strong point in sensory motor skills is like being able to be observant, to look a person in the eye and to see what's going on. Or referring to group 2 smell, being able to smell if you're working with alcoholics, to know if they are under influence of alcohol when they enter or not, to pick that up really easily. So this is more or less the summary.
Thank you.
Great. Room number 4 was Mahatma.
The theme of our group was procrastination in dealing with the many things that need to be done and the overwhelm that comes with it, and the physical bodily sensations that go with procrastination, like pressure in the chest and fatigue and headache, and the joy that comes from pushing through that and doing the things that need to be done, properly prioritized, which tends to trigger more procrastination. Just noticing the sensation of what happens in the body and the disconnect between the body and the mind, and then if and when people get through that, the joy of feeling connected again and the energy starting to flow.
Thank you.
And then Catherine's was the guide for room 5.
I forgot to unmute. Yeah, so it seemed for our group, Have I managed to unmute? Yeah. It seemed for our group that the act of looking down the list of senses was quite rewarding, and people were reflecting both on their less active senses and the ones that were sent for that, some of them sensitive. And for a couple of people, that led them to share that they felt really like deep diving into their ones that they wanted to develop more, that they found ease with, but also then wanted to extend into for either self-expression or playfulness around movement, and in a more general sense around senses and finding the value, that the importance of the senses and perception in work with the people that we work with. And for me, I had a very strong feeling about the both the menopause affecting this differently, pushing forward ADHD symptoms for me, but also that the shame associated with it, it's maybe not shame, maybe it's strategies. That's all I need. So that was a nice takeaway. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, group. So that was fun.
Thanks. Thanks, Catherine.
Okay, Claire.
So I guess what we talked about was the distinction between autism spectrum and highly sensitive people. There is an overlap. The overlap is being overwhelmed by all these senses that we're talking about: too loud, too bright, too fast, too tight. But highly sensitive people, which I have a hunch most of us on this call qualify, it's about being extremely connected to people and feeling nuances, subtleties, reading faces very well. So it's almost the opposite of autism. But there's the crossover, which is being overwhelmed by the world. And how do you take care of yourself and acknowledge that autism and high sensitivity is actually a gift. It has so many wonderful, rewarding features, but you have to protect it too. You have to protect it and know your limits and have your whatever it is you want to do to protect your sensitivities. And we ended up talking about dancing. I've been dancing hula for 20 years, and I had someone from Munich, and we ended up talking about how dancing is one of our protective ways of accommodating our sensibilities.
Great. And then our last group.
Kelly, go ahead. Thanks, Claire. Kelly, go ahead.
Thank you, Claire. That you're so right, that there is a lot of overlap there. And I just want to point out that some autistic people who meet all of those criteria fully for autism, some are very good at reading people. And that's one of those things. I think that most autistic people will say that eye contact is very painful because there's so much information coming off of people's faces and eyes. So sometimes they miss things because that's so overwhelming that they cannot process all of that. But there are a lot of different things that distinguish autistic people from highly sensitive people. And, it's just one of those things where the exception kind of makes the rule, that I sometimes meet autistic people who are very good at reading people. So.
And then we have just one more group. Our last group leader is Cynthia.
Hi. So we talked about the difficulty concentrating when there's more than one thing happening at the same time, especially when it comes to studying. Procrastinating is also part of our group, the initiating unpreferred activities. We talked about being aware of your own body and the muscles in your body, and that sometimes like upper strength versus lower strength challenges. And we talked about orienting oneself in space and how like a sense of direction it can be challenging, where you are in space.
Lynn, thanks for keeping track of all of this. Kelly, thanks for giving all this really rich information about this topic and giving us a new way, for me anyway, this World Cafe of meeting and listening. And what I'm so struck by is that in introducing the senses in the way that you did, every group sort of had a different idea of how it was, and then true to your concept, we all got to learn from it. So that's great.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. It was really fun.
Good for us. Oh, for me, I'll say. So thanks very much.